Hi, my name is Jackson Lashier. I'm the head of our Philosophy and Religion department here at Southwestern College. We are committed to bringing in top scholars in their fields each year to enhance the education for our students, our alumni, and our friends in ministry. A few days ago, we had Dr. Drew Dyson on our campus to help us learn how the church can best connect with young adults. I would like to invite you to join Dr. Dyson for his insightful lecture on this important topic. After the lecture, please join us on our discussion of the topic online at our Builders in Ministry blog. Welcome, and thanks for joining the exploration.
All right, thank you very much. I am excited to be here with you all and to arrive from New Jersey. I'm grateful for the Kansan hospitality that I received, and I specifically here want to thank President Merriman and Dean Shepard, Steve Wilkie and Jackson and others on the faculty and staff for the welcome here, for being part of this Builders in Ministry conference and an opportunity to do this Parkhurst lecture. I did travel from New Jersey yesterday, and New Jersey is, I was explaining to Charles Harrison just a few minutes ago that New Jersey really is a good place. It's known as the Garden State. Most people think of it as Newark or the surrounding city areas, but I come from the garden part of the Garden State. And just for the record, the entire cast of Jersey Shore is from New York. So they really are not New Jerseyites. So you can't assume New Jersey is anything like that. Well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to be here tonight to talk about Wesleyan missional theology and emerging adults, to continue a little bit from what I was discussing with some people this afternoon at our workshop, but specifically tonight to look at some of the ideas behind missional theology from a Wesleyan perspective, and to look at some sociological aspect of emerging adulthood. And I want to begin this evening simply by talking about a little over 12 years ago, I was invited to be the director of a denominational initiative that Jackson mentioned, the Shared Mission Focus on Young People, and it was a program office created by the General Conference of the United Methodist Church to develop. Our mission was to develop a comprehensive denominational strategy for youth and young adult ministry. And so our team worked from 2000 to 2004 and presented in May of 2004 legislation to create the Division on Ministries with Young People, which is now a division of the General Board of Discipleship. And it was one of those things where I worked as part of the formation of this team and the formation of what was going to be this denominational strategy. And as the legislation passed, I had this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The bishop who was presiding at the time called the conference to a halt and said something to the effect of, and this is from the minutes in the Daily Christian Advocate, he called it a historic turning point in the United Methodist Church in its ministry with youth and young adults. But I had this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I questioned to myself, was the investment that we were making in it as a denomination in organizational structure really worth the money that was being spent? Could there be a more efficient and effective denominational structure? Absolutely. Would it enable any real change in ministry with youth and young adults on the ground? I wasn't so sure. And so I sat there at General Conference wondering about that in the moments when I did it. And as I sat and left the conference that afternoon, I went to a small coffee shop in downtown Pittsburgh, just a few blocks from where the sessions of the General Conference were being. And I was still reeling with all these questions when I ran into a young man named Scott. Scott was 22 years old, and he was a delegate to the General Conference from the Northeast, one of the annual conferences in the Northeast jurisdiction. And he came in to join me, and I remember him asking me if I was excited about the legislation passing. And I remember my response was something a little more lukewarm, but we had a good conversation that afternoon about his role in the life of the church. And Scott, who had been a delegate to the General Conference, talked about how he enjoyed the political workings of the denomination and the opportunity that he had to serve as a delegate, but he also told me that he would eventually be leaving the church like most of his friends. And I remember as the words that he spoke as we neared the end of the conversation, he said, "Ultimately, Drew, the church that I grew up in has become irrelevant, and I'm afraid there isn't any legislation that can fix that." This was one of those moments for me when I knew that it had happened again. Another young person, extraordinarily active in the life of the church, someone that raised through the ranks of a local church and district and conference ministry, the kind of young person that we would consider among the best and the brightest, had already begun to lose his connection to the church that he once loved. So I returned home from General Conference determined to connect with young adults from my own ministry as a youth pastor and a pastor, and I sought them out to learn about their faith development in the years since. And there were lots of long conversations in coffee shops and in other places where I found young people that had wandered away from the church without looking back. And most of the young people that I talked to talked about a generic faith, but had the belief that the church wasn't important in their ability to live out that faith. So that's what led me to my research, which is on emerging adults and missional theology, because I began to have these questions. Why are so many young people active in the life of the church leaving for other things? Why are we failing to reach out to new generations of emerging adults? What are the things that we're missing? And in my research and my thinking and my conversations, I began to be convinced that there was more to the story than simply finding new attractive models for emerging adult ministry that would draw young people to the church. Because what I realized was emerging adults don't seem to be falling away only because there aren't programs in place to meet their needs. Somehow they're not convinced that the church is important to their lives or necessary in the world. And so more than just addressing these structural changes or programs to accommodate emerging adults, there's a deep need, I believe, to re-examine our ecclesiology as a church, to fully understand why it is that young people are turned off. And so I started with my own tradition in United Methodism. Well, along the way, I was at Princeton doing research, and I encountered this conversation on ecclesiology taking place in these academic circles, and it was, as Jackson said, largely missing any influence of John Wesley. So I would read the works of these prominent missional theologians like Darrell Guder and David Bosch and Leslie Newbegin and other missional theologians, and it was largely rooted in Reformed and Bardian theology, and Wesley was nowhere to be found in the conversation. And that for me was an awakening moment, because certainly I think for those of us who are United Methodists and have some Wesleyan history or Wesleyan theology in our background, we know that our theology and our practice has a strong affinity for missionary zeal. And Wesley would certainly add to this conversation in significant ways. And so that's one of the things that I set out to do. And this lecture tonight looks at that research and examines this perceived failure of mainline Protestant churches, and particularly the United Methodist Church, to reach and retain this cohort of young people, in hopes of developing strategic guidelines to help faith communities in more effectively connecting young adults with the ministry of the church. It is my contention that the church can more faithfully minister with and among emerging adults and address this current crisis of emerging adult faith drift by offering young people a community of belonging that embodies the Missio Dei in its corporate life and worship, a church that witnesses to God's redemptive love for humanity by sharing life together in authentic community, that takes a radical posture of welcome and hospitality to the surrounding culture and actively engages young people in service and justice and mission, leading towards the transformation of the world in light of the kingdom of God. So in order to do that, we have to begin by looking at what scholars call emerging adult faith drift. And this afternoon I shared some statistics about faith drift, a phenomenon that led Raleigh Martinson to dub emerging adults the invisible generation. And we don't need to review that, but we can simply, all of us here, can simply think about the churches that we're a part of, and how many young people that were active as youth who are no longer active in our congregations today. And all these statistics and the anecdotal realities that people look at have led leaders of the Methodist Church to declare a state of emergency on behalf of the church and issue this challenge to lower our average age or to get younger. And so these attentions, while laudable, simply sound the alarm on this trend without doing anything to help focus the denomination on what the true call of the church is. I'm aware of very few young people who would throng to a church whose primary appeal is, please come back to our church. We're getting so old, we don't have the power that we once did. If you don't join us, we're going to die. Yet that's the exact appeal that seems to ring from every level of leadership in our church, our agencies, our seminaries, even our pastoral leaders, and from the lay people in local churches. But my question is, do we have a different appeal to make? Do we dare to envision a future where emerging adults are deeply engaged in our faith communities, where young people are growing in grace and living out a passionate faith with missional zeal? And while so many churches and leaders anxiously scan the horizon for the next great program to come to us out of Nashville or Leawood or somewhere in Ohio, I wonder if there's a real crisis that doesn't stem primarily from a lack of programmatic creativity or money or institutional will. Rather, I wonder if there's these misguided cries of lament and these failed structural efforts that I was a part of to reform denominational structures are really laden with a deep love for young people and a passionate desire to see them experience the goodness of God's grace. And it's my contention throughout this project that more critical than programmatic development and financial commitment is the recovery of a revitalized and robust missional ecclesiology that offers a compelling vision for the church and helps young people see the church as a vital and vibrant voice in the world, helps young people experience their faith as something that makes a difference in who they are, something that calls them to participate in something bigger than they are, and engages them in this in the world. So my research started out by looking at communities where churches are getting it, where young people are engaged. And I've completed these qualitative case studies, and I'm going to share with you tonight 3 congregations that have been recognized by different leaders as having effective ministry with emerging adults. And I examined not only these, I want to share with you not only a brief story of these congregations, but also to share with you the core theological commitments that they make. I'll share these distinct stories of congregations that have discerned creative ways to live out their call to minister to emerging adults and to engage them in meaningful ways within the community of faith. In the first story, you'll encounter young people with passion who responded together to the Spirit's nudging to minister to the unchurched and dechurched teenagers on the Jersey Shore. In the second, you'll hear the story of an aging rural church willing to lay down its own life to create a space for emerging adults to encounter the gospel of Jesus Christ. And finally, you'll encounter a bishop and a pastor in an Anglican church in the UK with a vision to develop a church whose missional priority is designing and developing new forms of church with young people in the community. Now, anytime you offer up best practices, it becomes a danger because some people hold them out as models, and we see this in our denomination where there's best practices that take place, and all of a sudden what happens is those best practices become models for everyone to follow. What I'll say is most important about ministry with emerging adults is getting to know your own context and the emerging adults in your region, and not look to implant something from somewhere else. Certainly to look for best practices as guides and possibilities to spur your thinking. But the most important thing that you can do in ministry with emerging adults is begin by having conversations with the emerging adults in your community. And so I don't want these 3 case studies to be things that we look to for programmatic examples of what to do, but rather guides for how people did contextual ministry. The first church is a place called Outreach Redbank. It's a community church on the shore of New Jersey. Heavily affected. Actually, Redbank was heavily affected by Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, that went through New Jersey, and Redbank was one of the areas that was significantly hit, and Outreach Redbank has been involved in that. Outreach Redbank started because there was a large Presbyterian church in the town of Redbank, and there was a group of youth leaders within that Presbyterian church who felt that God was calling them to reach out to young people in the community outside of the church, specifically with kids who were skaters and kids who were playing basketball and hanging out in the community. Well, the leaders of the church got together and told these youth leaders, no, you have to take care of our kids. You're here to take care of our kids, not to do this ministry. So this group of youth leaders decided, they got together, they prayed about that, they decided that God was leading them to do this ministry, and so they set out to form this new ministry. They invited someone who was a student at the time, a doctoral student at the time, to come and be their pastor, and he left the doctoral program that he was part of to join this ministry and create an outreach ministry to young adult or to youth at the time in this shore community. And it started simply by talking to kids in the skate park. And they would talk to kids in the skate park, and then they began to do a Bible study in the park around, and kids from the surrounding areas. Pretty soon, they had about 40 youth who were meeting in the basement of someone's house. Someone just volunteered up their basement. They were meeting there in the basement of the house. And it was a youth program like many typical Young Life programs. But as they did this youth ministry and they were sharing the gospel, and young people were opening their lives to the possibility of what God was doing in and through them, they decided they wanted to start to worship together. And so they had to find space to do that. So they rented out space in an old Episcopal church that's in downtown Redbank, and they worshiped in that old Episcopal church where they continued to, and that became the home of Outreach Redbank. And the significant thing about Outreach Redbank is the kids that come there do not look like any typical church program around, but rather look like the high school, reflective of the high school. There are kids from all different walks of life, kids of different races, kids from different groups, from socioeconomic groups, from goths and skaters and punks, and all of these kids that come together. But then what started happening is this. They started having such an incredible experience at the church that they wanted their parents to come too. So Outreach Redbank became this multi-generational church. So within the span of 5 years, it went from a Bible study in a skate park to 200 people in worship that was multi-generational, who still understands their primary participation in God's mission in the world, reaching out to young people in the community. So you have a multi-generational church with people from all ages still focusing on young people in the community. And the primary leaders are young adults. Young adults, emerging adults, are the ones who are leading all the different ministries. They're the ones that are preaching. It wouldn't be abnormal in this church community to come in to worship on a Sunday night and to experience young people who do it involved in all aspects of the worship. Much like I've heard happens here in worship here, where young adults are and students are the ones leading in worship. So this is Outreach Redbank. The second church I want to highlight for you is in a small town in New Jersey called Asbury, New Jersey. It's named Asbury because Bishop Francis Asbury, when he was in New Jersey, it was the first place in New Jersey where he preached. The church has a cornerstone that's for the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century. And so you have, or from the 17th century into the 18th century, you have a 1786 cornerstone at Asbury United Methodist Church. It once reached its pinnacle in the 1960s, as many of our churches probably had, and then began to decline to the point where the aging group of the congregation ended up with about 9 members left. And the local pastor, her name is Gina Yeske, was sent to this church predominantly with the understanding that she was going to close the church. And so she went in and met with the administrative council group, and there was no, they had already done the discipline requirements for closure, and it was moving in that direction. And she asked the congregation, in your death, what do you want to do? What is God calling you to do, even as your congregation is beginning to fold? And so they began to pray about this, and she began to specifically ask them the question, what is God up to in this community that we have a chance to be a part of? Well, the church had about $70,000 to $80,000 in funds. And one of the older members of the congregation decided that they were going to start talking to people in the community. And then a couple of them decided they wanted to go to the local community college and talk to some young adults. Because one of the things that they had in common was most of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren were disconnected from the church. And so they went into the community college, started talking to young people, and what they found in this rural community in New Jersey, 20 miles from any big town or big city or anything else, is that young people didn't have a place to congregate. They didn't have a place where there was Wi-Fi and comfy couches. There was no Panera or Starbucks or anything close by. So in these conversations with these young people, they said that would be ideal. So this church took out of their $80,000 left in reserve, they took about $60,000 to $65,000 of those reserves and invested them into a complete renovation of the basement level of the church. And you go down into these old Murphy doors that open up, and downstairs, and you can see some pictures here of it being renovated with a new fireplace, and it's got Wi-Fi and television and comfortable seating areas. And the reason it's called the wine cellar is the focus of the ministry is a Sunday night worship service. Worship service is at 9 o'clock, dinner's at 8 o'clock. People start gathering at 7 o'clock, and they spend the evening together, they worship together, and Eucharist, the celebration of Holy Communion, is at the center of what they did. So in the wine cellar, you have a church that was willing to lay down its life. Now I ask you to imagine what happened at that church. A church that had no more than 9 or 10 people in worship on any Sunday morning, all of a sudden on Sunday nights, there were 30, 40 cars in the parking lot and 100 people that were coming at 9 o'clock at night in this small rural community. So people in the community, what do you think they started to do? They started talking about it and started noticing it. And they started asking questions about it. And all of a sudden the church began to be relevant again. And people started to say, well, if that's the kind of mission that the church is a part of, I want to be part of that. And most of the people in the community didn't start coming to worship at 9 o'clock on Sunday night. Most of them were asleep at that point. But they started coming on Sunday morning. So a church that was down to 11 now has 40 or 50 people on Sunday morning and about 100 kids on Sunday night in a worship service. Because you had 9 people who were on their deathbed willing to lay down their life and to get out of the way to be a part of what God was doing. Small rural church, like many of our churches around here, that were willing to invest in emerging adults. And then the last is St. Lawrence's in the United Kingdom in Reading, England. St. Lawrence is an Anglican church that's been there since the 12th century, and the spire that you see there is part of the original building. It had become largely empty, and it looked nothing like the surrounding community. So the bishop of Reading called on one of his vicars, one of the leaders in the church at the time, and the bishop said, I want to develop a new form of church alongside of young people, and I want you to help me to do it. So the bishop and the Anglican Communion invested a few $1 million. Now this is a significant investment. Bishop, if you can get any of your colleagues to do that, then we're golden. But they invested a few $1 million in converting this 12th century building into one of the most phenomenal churches I've ever walked in, because they kept much of the historic appeal to the building with every bit high-tech, high-energy, complete modern feel to it as you walk in, and developed a ministry with the young people in the community of Reading, and has grown phenomenally because they decided this was their mission, to see non-church young people come to faith and to create new forms of church with them. And that with them is very intentional, because it's not to create new forms of faith or new forms of church for them. Right? And so often we get captured in what we're going to do for young people. But the church that's built up around this because there was a bishop with vision and a denomination willing to invest significantly in that vision, and a complete transformation that happened. So I tell these stories, and as I begin to share these stories with people around, you can imagine that these stories of effectively reaching emerging adults for many people in communities fall like buckets of rain on parched, dry land that offer hope to struggling churches. And so church leaders set out in desperation to discover these new programs or models to revitalize ministry with emerging adults in their own context. And that's how we have books published and models created and leaders spotlighted in this attempt to reverse the downward trajectory. Chris Russell is the vicar of St. Lawrence's, sees this all the time. He said this to me. He said, "It's really weird, Drew. For the longest time, we didn't have anyone interested in what was going on here. Now people show up from all over the world to try and see what magic runs through our water." He said, "What's sad is that they're intensely craving a quick fix. And what they discover is that there's no magic, just a lot of prayer and a lot of commitment to discover how we can build church alongside of and not for young people." So for church leaders looking for models to replicate, these congregations aren't the place to look, but for practical theologians who are willing to look at their own community to say, what is God calling us to do, calling us to sacrifice, calling us to give to make a difference in the lives of young people, this is exactly where we need to turn. So in these conversations, what happened was three significant theological commitments emerged that crossed all three of these congregations. First of all three faith communities were clearly marked by a radical commitment to genuine openness and divine hospitality. The members of these communities understood that the deep welcome that they received was not only something to experience from themselves, but something that God was calling them to extend to others, and something that distinguished their faith community from others that many of them had experienced directly. So this genuine hospitality was significant for them, and this openness to people in their communities. Second, in each of these congregations, the young people understood that having experienced this deep welcome and this deep hospitality, it quickly moved from belonging, or to being welcomed, to belonging. And so young people in these congregations found genuine communities of acceptance, genuine communities of belonging, and faith communities and their leaders worked diligently to create a communal identity that young people would be drawn to. And finally, in all these congregations, young people were called, equipped, and challenged to engage in purposeful work and service to the world. So vocation was a significant thing to all three of these churches as well. So you have the idea of radical openness and hospitality. You have the idea of identity and belonging in community. And you have the idea of vocation. Now, when you look at that in sociological perspective, and what we know about the sociological needs of emerging adults, there's three specific sociological questions that young adults are asking, or that young adults want to ask of communities that they are being a part of, they're investigating being a part of. The first question is, do I belong here? Do I belong here? Rachel remembers walking through the doors of the old Episcopal Church in Redbank, wondering whether or not she would fit in. She wore black lipstick over her pierced lips and carried an attitude that even she described as proving my worthlessness. She walked in and quickly found a seat closest to the door. And within 5 minutes, she said, 3 people were sitting with me, asking me all sorts of questions about normal life. They were interested, and they were real, and they weren't even leaders of the group. They were just other kids, and I knew from that moment that I belonged here. So this question of do I belong here is significant for emerging adults. And we know from Christian Smith's research with emerging adults that being located in social groups that themselves have formed and sustained meaningful collective identities, that one can come to know who he or she is and what one should do with their life. This need for human and belonging has a long history. We can trace it back. We can look at Abraham Maslow's theory on the hierarchy of human needs. And even though several theorists have sort of done away with Maslow's hierarchy, the existence of an ontological human drive for belonging remains a commonly accepted sociological fact. So in all 3 of these churches, young people found a place where authentic belonging was real for them. The second question for them is, does this belonging matter? If I belong to a community, does it matter? Does it matter in my life, and does it matter beyond my life? And the young people in these congregations discovered that while belonging matters, being a member of these communities also created a strong sense of purpose and meaning In each of these congregations, young people were engaged in missional living in the world, whether it was the students at Outreach Redbank who developed a program that they called Forbes, which was a fundraising program to raise funds to combat poverty in the Redbank area. And Redbank is actually an upper middle class area, but the young people themselves became very aware of what we call hidden poverty, and the poverty that you don't see in the big homes that you pass. And so they engaged in this work that they called Forbes, that was outreach to combat poverty in the area, or the young people in Asbury, New Jersey, creating an agricultural garden and then working towards legislation that changed the state of New Jersey's policy for providing fruits and vegetables to senior citizens. In all sorts of different ways, young people were given meaningful activity in the life of the church. Viktor Frankl, in his work, Man's Search for Meaning, wrote this. He said, "It didn't really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. And our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and right conduct. Because life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets forth for each one." So from a sociological perspective, the young people in these communities found not only a place to belong, but also a place to make meaning of their life, to make their life make sense, to have a vocation that they connected to. And the third question that I think young adults are asking is, what about them? Meaning, what about the people beyond the church? Christian Smith's subcultural identity theory identifies that in order to strengthen religious communities, the greatest way to strengthen religious communities, according to Smith, was to create a strong outgroup. In other words, we have a collective identity, and we understand who we are as a church over and against everyone that's out there. And so in order to have a strong identity as a church, it's us versus them. And Smith, in his work on American evangelicals, said that the evangelical church grew so much because it did just that. Because it was able to say, this is who we are, and that's who they are, and we're different. The problem is, with emerging adults, that falls completely flat. Because they don't look for communities that are over and against everybody else, but rather communities that are radically with and for everybody else. How can we be communities that are radically open to the others in our community that at one time would have been considered those out there? And so as we look at Smith's subcultural identity theory, we begin to see a way forward in this understanding of emerging adult connection with the church. Because it's a quest for openness, where young people want to know that everyone belongs and everyone can belong. Nate was one of the young people that I met at the wine cellar, and Nate stated it powerfully when responding to a question about the uniqueness of the ministry at the wine cellar. He said, "I am here because I belong here. I belong here because everyone belongs here. If those doors weren't open for everyone, no matter what, then none of us would still be here." That's what makes it different. So emerging adults like Nate are on a quest for churches where there's an openness to the community around, an openness to the experiences of others, an openness to experiences that at one time may have been out there in the church as something to be over and against. So do I belong here? Does it matter? And what about them? And then we turn to Wesleyan missional theology. And I would look at three things theologically from Wesley. The first one that I raise in my research is Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace. And we all know, if you have some Wesleyan tradition, if you've ever had a confirmation class in the United Methodist Church, we know that prevenient grace is our awareness of God's presence in our life long before we're ever aware of it, that's nudging us and leading us into a life of faith. But for me, prevenient grace was summed up in Brandon's story. Brandon was a kid who had a personality larger than life, and from the moment I entered the wine cellar, I was aware of his place as a leader and spokesperson for the community. Well, as I got to know him and hear his story of brokenness, acceptance, healing, and renewal, I believe that I truly understood one of these theological commitments running at the heart of the vital ministry at Asbury. As a young man growing up in a devoutly conservative Christian family and struggling to come to terms with his own sexuality, Brandon came to believe that he was unworthy of God's love and unwelcome in the church. And as a community college student, he was invited and agreed to join a friend at the wine cellar for Sunday meal and worship. And he said, from the moment I walked in, I was accepted and I was welcomed, and there was no judgment, and there was no fear, and there was no hatred. I was loved, and I just felt it. And being who I am, I haven't ever felt that way in church before. For the leaders of these congregations, and for my understanding as a missional theologian in a Wesleyan framework, Wesley's doctrine of prevenient grace does just that. It enables us to see the presence of God in every young person. Wesley said, there's no human wholly void of the grace of God, meaning every person that we encounter, every person that we meet on our campuses, in our churches, in our communities, regardless of how they look or what they carry with them when they come in, every person has the presence of God's Spirit that marks them indelibly in their creation in the image of God. And that's good news. And that's the kind of church that young people want to belong to. For Brandon, it was this profound acceptance and inclusion that drew him into the ministry of the wine cellar, that awakened him to the presence of God's grace in his life. Yet it was an ongoing, intentional act of love and acceptance, coupled with a persistent invitation to new life in Christ, that led to his transformation. He remembers this. He says, when I first came here, I was struck by how much I was wanted and welcomed, and that really made me want to come back every week. But after a while, I realized that it wasn't only Gina and Jill, the two leaders, and everybody else that was welcoming me. It was God too. And one night during worship, Gina invited us to accept God's gift of love, and I did. And it was amazing. Prevenient grace, purposeful living, from a Wesleyan theological standpoint, has everything to do with Wesley's doctrine of sanctification and holiness and growth in holiness of heart and life. And in each of these congregations, there was this intentional commitment to sanctification. It wasn't simply a y'all come, but it was a y'all come, experience, encounter Christ, and then grow into the people that God wants you to be. And that work of sanctification, that work of ongoing growth and holiness in the lives of these young people is what became for them the most significant part of their experience. So they had this grand welcome, and they had this engagement in belonging in these communities, but they were also invited to live that out into the world. To do that in acts of holiness and mercy and justice. The conversation I had with another young person early in this research project is where the title came from. And he was talking about the church's irrelevance in young people. And he said, Drew, really, the church isn't that important in our lives anymore, because if we want to do anything spiritual, we can go to Borders or Barnes & Noble. And we can find something there that can meet our needs. And he said, if we want to change the world, it's really not the church that's looking to do that. We can simply join Bono in the One campaign. And so we have this idea, this is where the notion of Borders, Bono, and the bifurcated life comes from. Because young people today are saying, we don't need the church, because we can go to Borders here, we can go to Bono here, and life has become separated. But if you know Wesleyan theology and Wesley's theology of sanctification and holiness, you know that there's a unique place that we have as Wesleyans to meet this generation and say, no, in our churches, we combine together both a growth in holiness, a deep spiritual, experiential experience and encounter with God, and a holiness that's lived out into the world to make a difference in the world, to serve in places of injustice and poverty, and to reach into the world to be who God is calling us to be. And we're at a unique position theologically to tie those things together. And we don't have to live in this old bifurcation, this old divide between holiness on one side and sanctification or missional living on another. But rather, we can be at a place where those things come together. And then lastly, from a theological perspective from Wesley, I would look not only to the theology of prevenient grace and sanctification and holiness, but also to Wesley's work as a practical theologian in the system, the web of discipleship that he created. Classes, bands, and societies, the ways that people in the Wesleyan movement were connected in small groups, were encouraged to grow in their faith, were studying the scriptures together, were holding one another accountable. That's what young people experience in these communities. It's not only just these big gatherings, but it's also people who care about them and care about their spiritual development and care about their spiritual growth and ask them questions about how is God making God's self real to them in their lives in those moments, and how are they living that out in the world? And so Wesley's practical theology, his web of discipleship, is a way for us to get at that. So Wesley's practical missional theology offers this unheard voice in the contemporary missional conversation. And so this is how the research all came together. So you have the case study research that said these communities had a posture of radical openness, combined with the sociological question that young people were asking, what about them? Combined with a Wesleyan theological commitment to a generous welcome, a welcome that's open and inviting to all people through the doctrine of prevenient grace. Then you have identity and belonging in community with the question that young adults are asking of, do I belong here? With a theological commitment to purposeful living and sanctification and holiness of heart and life. And then a missional vocation with does it matter and Wesley's web of discipleship. Well, ultimately, I would argue this. Stories matter. The stories that young people hear, believe, and tell about themselves shape who they will become. The stories that pastors and parents and other key adults tell young people about what, not only through their words, but in their witness, shape young people's experience of and commitment to lives of discipleship. And the stories that churches tell about their life together shape their corporate identity and determine their missional effectiveness. Currently, there's an operative narrative in the mainline Protestant church and in the United Methodist Church in particular, and that's one of defeat and decline. And faithful people at all levels of church life are ardently seeking ways to stem the tide of institutional decline, to lower the average age of our congregations, to engage young people once again in the life of the church. But springing forth from the deep wells of their faithfulness and prayers are not new dreams for new life and calls for missional recovery, but cries that we have to get younger or we're simply going to die. And young people have responded to the decade-old clarion call with a resounding ho-hum. In New York City, there's another group issuing a rallying cry, not calling young people to join a sinking ship, but challenging young undercover agents, they call them, to join them in celebrating the goodness of life at random and unexpected places. And young people are responding by the thousands. There's a group called Improv Everywhere, founded in 2001 by Charlie Todd. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Improv Everywhere, but they define themselves as a New York City-based prank collective that causes scenes of chaos and joy in public places. And they invite young adults to join them on missions to bring joy and laughter in unexpected places. On one mission that you see a picture of here, they surprise a couple on the steps of City Hall in New York City. And what they do is they send out a tweet across the area to young people and say, this is the mission we're going to do. They did give them a little definition of what the mission is, and then young people come. Well, on this one mission, they decided to go to the steps of City Hall in New York, and they decided that the first couple that came out of having a civic wedding ceremony, they were going to throw a wedding reception for in the plaza right across the street. And so they had out there a tent, a dance floor, a fake bridal party, which all these people are part of this fake bridal party. They had wedding cake, they had gifts, they had a band, they had all sorts of things that were part of this. And this couple walks out of City Hall, and they've got 2 witnesses with them. And Charlie Todd, the director, meets them on the steps and introduces himself and says, "I'm from the mayor's office." First lie he told. "And the mayor wants to throw you a wedding reception." And so this couple wasn't expecting anything, and you see them in video, you can watch this online, and they kind of look at each other and decide, oh, okay, we weren't going to have anything, but this is great. So they walk across the street where this wedding reception is, and there's more than 250 people that are gathered in this park across the street that are young people, and they have all sorts of gifts for them, and again, the wedding party. There's even someone who's there to step in to do a dance as the fill-in father of the bride, to do a dance with his daughter. And he begins to dance and have this first dance. And what you see next on the video is amazing, because this other gentleman who is one of the witnesses to the wedding comes and taps the gentleman on the shoulder and asks to cut in. And later you learn that that was her father, who as a father of a daughter, I know for years has been dreaming of a dance that he now thought he might never had. But in that moment, because there were young people who decided that their mission was simply to create this scene of joy in an unexpected place, he had a dance that he never thought he would end up having. There's another one, and this one's my favorite, where they're on the streets outside of Macy's department store at Christmas time. And, you know, the one constant outside of a department store at Christmas time is what? Anybody know? The Salvation Army bell ringer, right? Ding, 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 ding. Well, they had, Improv Everywhere had worked with the bell choir at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, one of the largest churches in New York City. And they decided they were going to accompany the Salvation Army bell ringer. So you see him. This is, we learn later, this gentleman, Hispanic gentleman, doing his job. He was there. Ding, 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 ding. And all of a sudden, this person comes next with the biggest octave bell, the lowest octave bell, and just starts standing there. Dong, dong, ding, 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 dong. And then one by one, this bell choir comes and joins them. And within about 5 minutes, they're playing the Hallelujah chorus. And so this whole scene is transformed. And it's not just a scene that's transformed for all the shoppers and others that stop and are watching what's taking place, that have this holy moment, but all of a sudden, this guy is wrapped up in a whole new experience. He said in an interview at the end of the experience, he said, "I always knew that I was good at my job, but tonight I was really good." Young people are joining these missions by droves, stunningly and a bit disappointingly, to be honest, at least from my perspective. Improv Everywhere is not a Christian organization, and their mission is not related to the celebration and proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but simply to cause scenes of chaos and joy in unexpected places at unexpected times. And young people are joining by the thousands. It's my belief that emerging adults are longing for a church that offers such a compelling missional witness, a church that celebrates the joy of the gospel in unexpected ways among unsuspecting people in surprising places, a church that has a compelling story to share with the world. Missional theologian Tom Sine wants to challenge the church to rediscover what it means to party the gospel, and he wants young people to lead the charge. He wrote this. He said, "I encourage Christians to begin the journey into a more authentic and whole life, not by simplifying, but rather by celebrating the good life of God, to create celebrations that put forth a very different vision for the human future, imaginative, joyful celebrations around the imagery of God's homecoming as a banquet feast, or a harvest celebration, or dare I say, a wedding celebration on the streets of New York City." That's my vision for a missional church that offers young people a compelling narrative that engages them in an authentic missional witness that celebrates the goodness and joy of God's grace. In the end, it's my contention for the church to effectively invite young people into a life of discipleship and shared life in Christian community. We have to begin by changing our communal narrative from one of defeat and decline into one of celebration and joy. To proclaim an embodied missional witness through our life together and through concrete action of mercy and justice in light of God's reign. And as young people begin to hear a compelling story of missional vitality, as they discover their essential and active role, not only in participating, but leading the church's proclamation of that narrative, it's my first firm belief and my fervent hope that they will respond with passion and vision in guiding our missional witness. That's my prayer for the church. That's my hope for missional communities. By God's grace, may it be so.